Okay, enough with the wasting time. Let's start the webinar. Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special educational event from the Environmental Forum of Marin titled Waterscape, Watersheds and Human Dependency. My name is Anne-Christine Strugnell, and I'm the Communications Director here at the Environmental Forum of Marin, otherwise known as EFM. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Marin County is on the unceded traditional homelands of the Coast Miwok people. EFM was founded almost 50 years ago to educate people in Marin about the environment of this beautiful place and to inspire them to take action on environmental issues. We do this through lectures such as this one and also through Forum 2021, a series of events and classes that helps train people to become environmental advocates. Today's webinar will focus on the critical topic of water. Just as climate scientists have warned us for decades, the Western United States is becoming drier, and the recent drought has focused attention on the urgent issues of the water supply in California. While in our day-to-day lives, we typically focus on just water for our homes and gardens, today's speakers will challenge and invite us to take in the bigger picture of water and its many roles, especially here in Marin. Before we start, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Drawdown Marin. Your registration fee covers only a part of the cost of putting on these events, so we rely on the generosity of sponsors to help us keep this show on the road. One other housekeeping note, during this event, if questions occur to you, please enter them in the Q&A function of Zoom, not in the chat. I'll be pulling together questions from the Q&A to ask our speakers at the end of the event. We look forward to having you join us for an event that will help you to understand California's water issues in a way that encompasses not just the water needs of people, but of other species as well. And as always, we'll be also be offering up ideas for how you can help to make a difference on these crucial issues. So if we could put up the slide with the agenda. Just to review the agenda, Obi Kaufmann will begin by talking about water in the context of biodiversity in California. Next up is Jay Lund, who will tell us what he has learned about how communities can cope with and adapt to dramatic changes in their water resources. We'll then hear from Cynthia Koehler, who will talk more specifically about how the Marin Municipal Water District manages a Marin watershed. But first, time for a quick quiz. If you had to guess, how much of Marin's water supply would you say is provided by the Mount Tam watershed? Do you think it's 100%? Do you think it's 75% or 50% or 25%? I sometimes read in the paper, we get water from the Russian River, we get water from a bunch of places. What percentage do you think it comes from the Mount Tam watershed? Okay, all right. Well, the correct answer is the one most of you have, which is B. 75% of the water that flows through your tap comes from the Mount Tam watershed, which is great for us because honestly, it's a local source of water, it's clean, and it helps ensure protection of the watershed, which we also use for enjoyment. But if we humans are taking so much of the water that falls on Marin, are we leaving enough for other creatures? Here to talk about the many other roles for that water is Obi Kaufmann. Obi is an artist, naturalist, and the author of several best-selling books that are both beautiful and important, including one called The State of Water, Understanding California's Most Precious Resource. Obi, can you help us shift out of our water district customer perspective and expand our understanding of what happens in the watershed?
Maybe.
Well, try.
I will. Today, I am going to focus my presentation on the salmon as a microcosm of biodiversity at large across California and locally there in Marin, specifically focused. And while I present a generalized overview of salmon conservation and its ecological importance, the salmon will present itself here as an emblem, a biological herald, if you will, to the greater story of water as the giver and maintainer of all life everywhere. The salmon can be the symbol of what is possible in connective thinking, network functionality, and truly sustainable communities. A herald of success and stewardship and reciprocity to the legacy that is our grandchildren's birthright. This connectivity to the past and to future generations a property of memory, and anadromous fish are beings of memory. It draws a map between not only habitat spaces and ecosystem functionality, but between members of our own species, the species that has the economic, aesthetic, moral, spiritual, and technical power to reckon not only with what and how it has grown so wealthy by the people and cultures and natural communities that have been so damaged by that process. Marin County is a unique place, and at a unique time holds a community of humans that are perhaps sensitive enough, wise enough, and indeed wealthy enough to lead in so much of what I talk about. As I present my work up and down the state, which is namely the emerging holistic paradigm of a post-carbon economy inside a human ecology that is seated in the identity of a human world that is not separate from nature. My own vocation exists as a tripod between the practice of being an artist, an author, and a naturalist. I regularly find myself as a science and a policy communicator as I take my license and my shield of being an artist to extrapolate meaning, a role often culturally filled by the journalist, namely to describe what is phenomenologically true. But I am able to take it to an inner world of psychology and aesthetic philosophy. And it is from this place that a better story is told. More so than ever relying on unrememberable information, I would like to tell a story of place and the living character of that place. More so too than ever coming up with an argument for conservation. I would like to tell a better story. In fact, that is the only then tool that has ever changed a mind from one way of looking at the world to another. I would like to avoid anything thought of as traditional political rhetoric in this essay and leave specific recommendations of the restoring and mediating of local salmon habitat in Marin County to the network of organizations intimately involved and connected to the implementation of such work. Some citizen groups that work on the grassroots level include, of course, the Environmental Forum of Marin, the Environmental Action Committee of West Marin, SPAWN and the Turtle Island Restoration Network, the Bay Institute, Marin Agricultural Land Trust, ONE-TAM, San Francisco Zen Center, Audubon Canyon Ranch, Marin Conservation League, the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, and Save Point Reyes National Seashore, to just name a few of the many strongly connected and networked organizations, and not mentioning larger non-governmental organizations that are certainly involved, or the state, federal, or academic agencies and institutions, all of which to save the evolutionary significant units, the ESUs, the evolutionary significant units of our valuable state and federally endangered.
Our next, we're going to be talking about average household water use. And I realize that I personally don't have a really good idea about how much water I use on average. Water flows in by tap, and because I'm not hauling in gallon jugs of it each day, I don't really have a good sense about how much I actually use. And I think most of us don't really. So I was going to ask a quick poll question to get a sense of how much water we're talking about when we talk about the average daily use of a Marin household. So this is a gallon jug, and this question is about how many gallon jugs per person per day do you think you use in your household? So if you just picture that for a moment, how many gallon jugs would you need lined up in front of your house or apartment each day? If you did that, about how many do you think there would be? The answer, da-da-da, is 124, and which seems to me like a lot. And the question is that reasonable or sustainable? And what happens when we have to do with a lot less? Well, then let me introduce Jay Lund, ahead of his time, I hope, He's a professor at the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, and he will tell us what he has learned about how communities can cope with and adapt to dramatic changes in their water resources. So Jay, please help us to understand what's going on right now and how we can become more resilient in our drier climate.
So this is who I am. Something is important to know about water in California is nobody knows it all. Even people that have studied it for 30 years. Most people in California know that water comes from their tap and that ultimately it came from some rainstorm at some time or place, but we don't know a lot about what's going on in the middle. And even for people that work in the industry, there's a lot of what goes on in the middle that even experts don't understand because we specialize, and that's why it's so complex. One of the reasons why it's so complex. So the water lawyers and engineers usually only work on a small portion of what goes on inside that box. And so we all have to operate with some degree of ignorance in all of this. Little introduction to California's climate. In California, we have what's called a water year. It's a little different from the calendar year or the fiscal year, but it's our water year, and it begins nominally October 1st, which is usually sort of the end of our dry season. And then between October and roughly beginning of April or mid-April, that's when we have precipitation. And so you can see on this plot the major storms that have occurred in these different years. And so the wettest year of record is up here at the top. This is the cumulative precipitation for Northern California. You can see for this year, this is the dark blue line here, we had that huge storm, one of the biggest one-day storm events in the history of California, about a week or so ago. And then we've had a little storm just recently. So that right now, it's wetter in Northern California than the wettest year on record. In the drought year before us, this year 2021, we're more than half of, so far this year, it's more than half of all the precipitation we got in all of last year. And you can see how all this precipitation tends to come in big chunks. So the difference between a very wet year and a very dry year is how many big storms we get and how big the big storms are. Just to give you a little bit of a sense for the seasonal variability and in California. If you come from back east, like I do, it's very different. Here's another depiction of California's precipitation. And this shows the annual coefficient of variation, which is essentially statistically, it's how variable is the annual precipitation. And you'll see from back east, where I'm originally from Delaware, there's very little annual variation in precipitation in terms of the total precipitation per year. As you move further west, it becomes more variable, except up in the Pacific Northwest, where it's pretty wet most of the time. And then you get down to California, where it's very weird. You know, here we have very high coefficient of variation. And this basically means California has more wet years and dry years per average year than any other part of the country. So we have a lot more variability in precipitation and rainfall than any other part of the country. And I think this is very important for understanding how California's water system is developed, why we have a lot of irrigation, why we have a lot of reservoirs, and why we fight about water so much compared to much of the country. This variability also plays itself out in space. So this map on the left is a map of precipitation runoff in California. The very dark blue area is 20% of the surface area of the state. that's responsible for 2/3 of all the runoff. And the light blue and the dark blue together are 40% of the surface area of the state, responsible for 90% of all the runoff. And you can see where that is. That's north of where you are, for the most part, and up in the mountains. And then we have this darker red area on the map, which is 30% of the surface area of the state, is responsible for 0.1% of all the runoff in California. Well, where are all the people? And where's all the agriculture? Well, it tends to be in the dark red area and the yellow area and in the drier parts of the Bay Area. So where we have the big human water demands is where the water is not. This plays out also in terms of the seasonal patterns of when rainfall occurs and when we have water demands. So most of our water demands for urban areas are for watering lawns in the summertime. And for agriculture, it's for watering crops in the spring and summer, which is the opposite of when the water is available coming out of the sky and running off down the streams. So we have a big mismatch in terms of when humans want the water and when the water is available. So to make up for this, California is basically a heaven for water engineers, because we have all these reservoirs and all these aqueducts and all these pipelines and all these aquifers that we operate in order to move water from where it is to where we want it to be, to make money and to live in our houses and our lawns, and when we want it there. So we're moving water all over the place. And this map to the right sort of shows that and shows the relative size of the rivers, which is often quite modest compared to the aqueducts. And it also shows a little bit about the ownership of all these facilities. So we have the State Water Project, we have the red federal facilities, we have some facilities that are owned both by federal and state governments, and we have a tremendous number of facilities that are owned by local governments. Certainly the municipal water supplies that Cynthia Koehler is going to talk about later, they're all locally owned. And so most water management in California is actually local, but we have some very big federal and state projects that are also quite important. But what this colorful maps essentially shows is how colorful the politics and the ownership is, as well as the hydrology. An immense system. This system has evolved over 150 years or so, and it has served a very changing and dynamic economy, as well as dynamic population, a growing population, but the economic structure of those water demands is also quite variable. So we've gone from a mining economy to an agricultural economy to now agriculture is only 3 or 4% of the state's total economy, and services and the urban economy is now most of the economy, but we use less than 20% of the total water used for humans in the state, with agriculture being 3 to 4% of the economy, using 80% of the human water use. It's really important, I think, and it's been wonderful in these droughts to have essentially a substantial economic decoupling on a statewide scale of economic growth from water supply. This has been very, very important. The only sector for which this is not true is, of course, agriculture. And if you're in a rural part of the state, that coupling of agricultural prosperity to water supply still remains important. We've always had a lot of change in California. California's always been tremendously dynamic in its society and its economy and its cultures, and it's continuing to change. With sea level change, climate change, we're seeing changes in sea level, warmer temperatures. We're seeing substantially less snowpack and less spring runoff than we saw even a few decades ago, and that change is going to continue. We're certainly seeing it in this drought and last drought. We have changes in the deterioration of different things, from earthquakes and delta land subsidence, aging infrastructure. We have demographic changes that have impacts on federal and state finance, on globalization of our economy, which has always been pretty globalized in California, and then our population composition and urbanization. Ecosystems themselves have had tremendous changes in terms of new invasive species coming in, wildfire and forests, and tremendous degradation from the alterations of habitat and water flow in the state and in local areas. And then science and technology, new chemicals that we have to worry about, and new technologies to help us better understand what's going on, even though it's pretty daunting trying to understand what's going on. California's governance of this tremendous system is very decentralized. We have a lot of local government institutions. We have about 3,000 or 4,000 local water districts, water departments, irrigation districts that do most water management decisions, do 80% of water expenditures in the state. We have a very active state government, probably one of the most competent and capable state governments on water in the state compared to other states. Federal government that is very deeply involved in not only the flood control, but the water supply and the environmental aspects of water management in the state. Tremendous numbers of private decisions. All of the decisions you make in managing water for your household, all the decisions that are made by individual farmers or groups of farmers in the management of their businesses and their farms, their recharge projects, all of those things. Tremendous numbers of interest groups for a wide range of interests, particularly environmental, social justice groups that are quite important, quite useful, important for the management of the overall system. And so with a very decentralized system where there's sort of one hydrologic cycle underlying the whole thing, we have many contracts and agreements and lawsuits and court orders and different forms of compensation to share costs and to share water across these very many entities that have to get together to manage the system, and often get together in a very noisy, prolonged way. I mentioned water finance. 80% of all the water expenditures in the state are paid for locally with water bills, local water bills. About 10% of it is state, about 10% federal funding. We'll see how the infrastructure bill changes some of that. The beneficiaries pay for most of these services for the most part. As I said, a lot of contracts and some water markets have been very useful in adding some flexibility so that the water system can adjust to these very wet and very dry conditions over time. And overall, there's really very few subsidies by state and federal governments to water users at the local level compared to many other parts of the world. For the most part, the management approach we take to water now is that of a water portfolio management, where you'll see, and I expect that Cynthia's talk will emphasize some of this, there's really no silver bullet solution that is used to provide water. Very few places rely on only one water source. Very few places do not manage the demand as carefully as they manage the supplies. Very few places are not interested in managing groundwater as well as surface water. So we have a very diverse and interconnected water storage and conveyance system. Being able to manage these as a portfolio gives us much more ability to adapt to climate change, to adapt to very wet and very dry years, and hopefully over time, adjust these portfolios as we have to adjust further to climate change, adjust to try to hopefully have more successful environmental restoration efforts over time. So these portfolio management efforts have been much more successful than other approaches, but they do take a lot of time and some organized effort. This is just an example of the kinds of activities that exist in a water supply system portfolio management approach. You're managing different kinds of supplies and different kinds of infrastructure together, different kinds of treatment for different types of source water. You're managing the different types of water demand with many details involved in all of these, as well as some incentives to try to get this very decentralized system that has many different water decision makers helping them work together in terms of education and pricing and markets and subsidies and insurance and shaming, sometimes norming and shaming. These water systems really are giant social enterprises and legal enterprises and economic enterprises. And many people have to work well together for them to function well. These portfolios occur at the local level: water conservation, wastewater reuse, some cases desalination, water markets, operation of local reservoirs, and statewide in terms of interregional water markets, interregional transfers of water. Marin County perhaps importing water from East Bay Mud, things like that. Plumbing codes established at the state level. And so the planning and preparation for these systems rely quite a bit on how do you mix these actions to have an effective, resilient, robust portfolio that works well for more people. Some of the big challenges we have here are certainly environmental. We've really screwed up the environment in the last 150 years, probably more so than back east, which has been settled for many more centuries than California has been settled intensely. Another major problem that we have is the Delta, which is a major water supply for much of the Bay Area as well as much of the state of California, with all kinds of instability, from physical instability because of land subsidence. And this map shows much of the Delta in the central and western portions are 15 feet or more below sea level. So you can imagine how unstable that makes their situation in a condition where much of that land is still subsiding and the sea level is certainly rising, in a place that tends to have floods and earthquakes. We have a lot of ecosystem instability for the Delta and much of California, frankly, because of tremendous habitat alterations, the physical habitat, the hydrologic habitat, and all kinds of invasive species that we have brought in intentionally or unintentionally to these systems. And then some economic instability, certainly for the Delta, in terms of the high cost of repairing some of those islands relative to the economic value that the owners of those islands see. So that many of the blue areas you see on this map used to be farmlands until they flooded in an accidental flooding, typically. And the owners of the land just did an economic calculation, said, well, as a business, it's not worth repairing this island. And so they eventually become a state park or some other kind of inland lake, and essentially. So we have a lot of challenges in managing the Delta and managing our wildlands and what's left of our wildlands and our semi-wildlands across the state. We certainly are seeing that with the wildfires that are related to some of the droughts and climate change we've been seeing. Another major problem that the state has in droughts in particular, but I think even and increasingly in normal years, is rural drinking water problems affecting about 1 or 2% of the state's population. That these are small water systems that are very difficult to manage. They're often not very well organized. It's very difficult to organize rural populations in any cases, and they're small. They don't have much economies of scale. They're very often poorer communities, and they're vulnerable to drought drawdown that happens during dry years when the farmers locally want to maintain their increasingly profitable almond orchards. So we have a lot of very difficult problems there that will take us some time to overcome. Here at the university, we've been developing some very large integrated water supply management system models to help us look at the future with climate change, forcing us to better understand how all these many components fit together, both in the economics and the flow balances and the hydrology, as well as the environmental impacts. This is a very complex system. It always will be. I think as we move forward, there's some reasons for hope. I think there's a good bit of useful evidence that's showing that our human water use in California has largely peaked. We're not really expanding our irrigated areas very much. We're mostly shifting from annual crops to more permanent, more profitable crops. And that has some problems, but it also has some benefits in that there's more money in the economy of those regions to accomplish some good things socially. The economy today is much less dependent upon water in California than it used to be. If we were back in the 19-teens or 20s, when 20 or 30% of the economy was agricultural, and you had a drought, the economic threat to the state of California as a whole would be far greater than it is today, when only 3 or 4% of the economy relies on agriculture and irrigated agriculture. Use of water markets has been very useful in shifting water use from lower value uses to higher value uses and civilizing these kinds of transitions. I think we're going to probably need more of those kind of transitions to occur in the future with climate change, and we need to be prepared for that. And then I think one other reason for hope is where, particularly after these last few droughts, we kind of all agree that we have water problems. And hopefully that'll help us have more productive conversations on them. This slide shows the cumulative revenues, agricultural revenues, and the cumulative job production from different areas of crops in the state. And so basically what it shows is these higher value crops occupy about half of the surface area of agriculture in the state. And they're responsible for 85 or 90% of all the jobs and all the agricultural revenues. And so when we get into a drought, what we tend to want to do is to follow the lower value crops that are less important economically to the state and preserve these higher value crops. We have a very similar curve actually for Marin and most urban areas of the state, where about half of the water use is for lawn irrigation, which most people find to be less valuable than most of the indoor uses. So we, in both the urban and the agricultural sector, we actually have a fair bit of economic flexibility in managing shortages. So in conclusion, we have a very statewide complex water system, which is local, with a lot of local governments and very fragmented regulation, very limited state and federal abilities relative to local government. I know it doesn't seem like that from a local government perspective, but I think it is true. Most of the money and most of the flexibility is really local. Local government, I think, is the most important in water management. It's where most of the innovations come from. The complexity of this system enriches the possibilities for management. Complex systems they're a pain, they're very difficult to understand, but they often have a lot wider range of possibilities for operational changes and adaptation. And the idea of integrated portfolios for the future, I think, reflects this and how effective that approach has been. Nature and economics eventually prevail over the indecision and existing law that we have in water. And so we often see adaptations over time. The problems that we have are eternally changing, but California's dry conditions, its high variability, and its sizable population and economy and its dynamic nature, I think will make it so that we always have water problems, and these problems will always be challenging and always be changing. And overall, we've done a terrible job managing water, but relative to most other dry parts of the world, we've actually done pretty well. And then because I'm a professor, I will leave you with some further readings.
Well, thank you, Jay. And it looks like Obi is back on. Obi.
Thank you. Yes, the problems of the Zoom era. I cannot wait for the new emerging era of togetherness. Please let it come quickly. And Jay, thank you for that really erudite summary of exactly framing the problem in so many ways, and points for your Monet background. Thank you so much for that as well. Yes, indeed, right on. So I'm speaking to you here today from a rural community. My power went off, right? And I am in the small, strange town of Crockett, as I was saying, which is the northernmost point of Contra Costa County. Before and after the Anza expedition in the late 19th century, this was the land of the Carquin Ohlone, for whom the Carquinez Strait is named. For the Carquin salmon, I'm going to continue now with salmon a little bit because I think it's a nice focal point for this story. And in 10 minutes, I'm going to try and get to make some big points about our relationship to this very important and, in fact, keystone species. For the Carquin, salmon was ubiquitous as a staple. That it's so ubiquitous that it approached the dietary and cultural importance found among the northern coastal tribes, such as the Yurok of the Klamath River, for whom the word salmon simply translate as that which is eaten. In the world of the coastal Miwok of Marin County, or as they called themselves, the Likatuit, of whom Chief Marin was one, the food shed that the returning vernal and autumnal salmon in part provided was rich and complex, and salmon became part of a seasonal feasting cycle. But like the food shed, so too did the local ecosystem depend on returning salmon for the nutrient energy that the anadromous populations gave to the ecology simply by the way of their life cycle. Let me go see here if I don't break my internet again. We're gonna continue now with some of my paintings, as is my vocation and profession. So the salmon's energy-rich carcasses and eggs were consumed by a variety of predators in coastal watersheds, including pre-19th century populations of wolves and grizzly bears. In coastal areas where substantial populations of wolves still exist, their diet consists of almost 50% salmon, not ungulates or other mammals. Salmon support population of eagles, gulls, and seabirds by providing the nutrient essentials for overwintering survival and migrations. The amount of salmon in a stream is directly proportional to the density and diversity of bird species in the surrounding region-wide ecosystems. Furthermore, once they move out to sea, salmon instrumentality in the food web continues, as Chinook salmon are the primary prey for the southern resident killer whale, and of course, pinnipeds and toothed cetaceans. It is not just as prey do salmon populations influence the faunal makeup of their watershed, as half of their diet is insects. And historically, because of salmon numbers, populations of insects were kept in check. So these biotic influences I describe only begin to hint at the influence the salmon has as a so-called keystone species, or a species that without which the ecosystem would be fundamentally transformed. The biomass deposited from the expired salmon once it spawns in the headwaters of its birth, now in the form of potentially thousands of tons of calcium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, is delivered by animal agency and by flood, and by movement of the water table in the soil becomes an indispensable forest-wide mitigating fertilizer. All ecosystems are incredibly nuanced systems of complexity that are strengthened by diversity and weakened by simplification. Salmon are the hub of ecological functionality related to all service delivering aspects of their systems in a way that resemble how we are beginning to understand the biospheric systems that were once thought to be separate and are in fact functions of one another. Holding on to this interconnected vision, one where these systems are so interconnected as to appear singular, may be the roadmap and the compass towards, as Wendell puts it, solving for pattern. Saving one aspect of nature is like trying to free one Jenga block or save one Jenga block in the middle of the tower while the other blocks are being pulled free. When we recognize that the salmon problem is the water problem, is the soil problem, is the justice problem, is the economic problem, and is the climate problem, we can unlock nature's proclivity towards regeneration. Let me explain real fast. Because of that integrated vision of who we are and our role as stewards of the more than human world, at the end of what we now call the second industrial revolution, as we turn from market value to network value, we begin to tap untold resilience inside natural rhythms derived from human economies. And that economic abundance is rooted not in the myth of endless linear extraction of material and energetic resources, but in the reciprocal and regenerating forces inherent in the processes of the biosphere, augmented and supported by a new sharing economy. This new paradigm is not theoretical, but already implemented in so many facets of our daily life that the light beyond the fossil fueled bottleneck is visible. And it may be that we leave the 21st century with California's natural world in better shape than we left it at the end of the 20th century. I know that this is not the common line spoken when predicting the state of the biosphere over the next several decades, given climate breakdown by way of anthropogenic global warming, inciting so many feedback cycles that threaten to unravel the last great vestigial strongholds of complex regional and global biodiversity. But alas, guarded hope remains. Just reinforcing Professor Lund's observation there, hope remains because this sixth mass extinction that we are undergoing is caused by an agent that understands that it is doing so. And rising to meet the challenges it created are so many positive, subverting opportunities that are just as likely to tip that system towards catastrophic success as it is towards catastrophic failure. So we know that there is a through line from biodiversity to humanity's well-being. And supporting keystone vectors of biodiversity, like salmon, is our best bet for preserving that biodiversity while we continue to build the communication, energy, and logistics infrastructure platform that will deliver the biospheric consciousness of a new paradigm. In the new economy, where old arguments and false choices like farms and fish will no longer make sense to argue. As Professor Lund pointed out in one of his graphics, we've already decoupled the economy from water. We will soon decouple the economy from a great many other things that are these limiting factors to the great economic abundance that is happening when our marginal cost is reduced to zero across so many different sectors. And I'm talking here to, I know, people who think about these kind of things a lot. When I was touring my second book, The State of Water, Understanding California's Most Precious Resource, in the summer of 2019, I found that it is not actually the substance of water itself, like the subtitle implies, that is the state's most precious resource, but it is rather our ability to trust one another with the authority to tell a culturally defining story inside an equitable and functioning democracy at these end stages of our carbon economy. Perhaps by rallying behind the science-based symbol that the salmon represents, celebrating its delicate strength, might we grow the empathy in and between ourselves and recontextualize the story we tell ourselves of ourselves, now imbued and cognizant with and of that same strength, recognizing that by saving the salmon, we save ourselves.
Thank you, Obi, for just dealing with the interruption and the unwanted feeling of powerlessness. And,
my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for that remarkably hopeful view of where we might be headed with all this. I really appreciate that. It can be hard sometimes, as you know, to hear so many negative stories, and very important, as you also mentioned, to remember that stories we tell are powerful. So we need to be careful which ones we tell ourselves. That was lovely. Okay. So now I would like to introduce our final speaker, Cynthia Koehler, Board President of the Marin Municipal Water District and the Executive Director of the Water Now Alliance, which is a network of local water leaders advancing sustainable, affordable, equitable, and climate resilient water strategies in their communities. Cynthia was recently named a Marin Changemaker by Marin Living magazine for her work in the county as a water resources champion. Before we hear from Cynthia, I want to put up one more slide. Most of us here are MMWD customers, but how many of us know how much we are paying for each gallon of water that flows into our homes now that we know how much we get? I confess I've lived in Marin for more than 20 years, and when Cynthia asked me how much a gallon of water costs at my tap, I did not know the answer, but maybe you do. So here goes. How much do Marin water customers pay on average for a gallon of water? Remember, a gallon's this much. And also, Consumer Reports says that what you get from the tap is usually better quality than what you can buy in the store. So bear that in mind too. Okay, so no one thinks they pay $2.02. That's pretty good. But some are thinking it's as high as $1. Boy, we have such a range, $1 to 1 penny. That's big. Let's see. Okay, we've got a lot more people who could answer, I see. So let's give it another moment. $1.50, 1 cent, going. Okay. Well, you will be surprised and delighted maybe to know that it is in fact 1 penny. Only about half of you guessed the correct answer. I have to say both the average usage of water and the average cost were both a big surprise to me. So, Cynthia, we've all seen the headlines about Marin possibly running out of water, and there's this pipeline idea, and there's a lot of speculation about costs and rates. And as a water district customer myself, like most of the audience, I'd like to just take a pause from the panic, step back, and get a more complete picture of how Marin Municipal Water District plans to ensure a sustainable and climate resilient approach to managing water for us. Can you take it further from the top for us?
Sure, I absolutely can, and thanks for running my slides. Thank you so much for having me here today. It really is a delight being with all of you at the forum, and I'm just really so grateful that you're hosting this important conversation and that you've put together this great panel. So next slide, please. To start off, no, we are not going to run out of water, and thank you for suggesting a pause from the panic. It's not that the situation isn't serious. It is, as you can see from this graph. The orange line going to the very short green line shows the 2020-2021 water year. As Jay described, water years don't line up perfectly with calendar years. And then the very beginning of the 2022-23 water year in Marin. As you can see, our storage levels are well below average, average being that dotted line. I can also share a few numbers, which you can also always find on Marin Water's Water Watch page. It's updated pretty frequently. Currently, we have about 43,500 acre feet in storage. That's all of our reservoirs combined. This is just about 82% of average storage for this date, which is, usually about 53,000 acre feet. Just under that. So the combination of local conservation and the district's investments and incentives for longer term demand reduction and the recent rain have moved the needle on the severity of the drought somewhat, but we still have a ways to go. So next slide, please. Thank you. The forum asked me to talk a bit about the district's approach to water supply and drought planning. And the short answer is that, like all water districts in California and nationwide, Marin Water is in a constant state of planning for contingencies, both long and near term. And to Jay's point, we do not rely on a silver bullet approach, meaning looking for a single solution that's going to solve all of our problems magically. And to plagiarize former state board chair Felicia Marcus, we have embraced a silver buckshot approach, meaning that we build out a diverse water supply portfolio of many opportunities. As Jay also described, California has always had substantial variability in precipitation, true in Marin as well, with wild swings between high levels of rainfall and drought. Scientists tell us that climate change is likely to significantly exacerbate this, which we think we're seeing right now, with droughts becoming both more frequent and severe and potentially rainfall when it comes being more intense as well. These are the considerations that are at the forefront of our planning for local supply challenges. This slide lists a number of options that we've considered at a high level and about which there's been a fair amount of speculation on social media and in the press, unfortunately, much of it inaccurate. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of these other than to say there's literally no option we have not examined. The district has found that most of these listed here are either infeasible or impracticable or unaffordable at this point. The four options that have risen to the top are higher levels of investment in water reuse and efficiency, water transfers by means of an intertie to the East Bay, temporary desalination, as well as looking at winter water options with Sonoma County. Next slide, please. I'm taking these one at a time. When we think of conservation, we also think of it as a short-term, sorry, it's the end of a long day of talking. We often see it as short-term actions. Taking shorter showers, turning off the water when you brush your teeth, maybe not washing your car for a while. But investments in enhanced efficiency measures, as well as on-site water capture and reuse, present really critical water supply strategy and drought resilience opportunities. As we heard earlier, Marin customers use an average of 124 gallons of water per person. I want to emphasize, not per household, per day. That's certainly come down in the last 6 months as we've been conserving, but that's the official number from our last urban water management plan. The question is whether 124 gallons of water per person per day, or GPCD, so I don't have to keep saying gallons of water per person per day, whether that's reasonably sustainable in light of droughts like the current one. We know it's not necessary from the perspectives of human health, safety, and economic prosperity. To give you some context, Marin County's water use is fairly moderate compared to other communities, many of which consume right around 200 GPCD on average, and some hover around 300 in California. But the state legislature enacted a bill 3 years ago establishing conservation as a California way of life and set 55 GPCD as the ceiling for indoor water use. That's an important distinction. Marin has met that standard. So to oversimplify somewhat, over 50% of our drinking water is dedicated to outdoor and other non-essential uses of water of various kinds, such as leaks. I think that's consistent with what we just heard from Jay. Given our particular situation here, with limited local storage opportunities and really no groundwater aquifer to speak of, our most cost-effective and climate-resilient path to water supply security is to bring down our average water consumption to more sustainable levels. We've been moving steadily in that direction for some time, and our current GPCD is significantly lower than it was, say, 15 years ago. But we have a ways to go to be a fully efficient community. The good news is that water tech and other innovations are making on-site reuse and efficiency the fastest and generally the most affordable path to sustainability. But in addition to demand reduction, in keeping with the silver buckshot theme, the district has also, of course, been exploring other options. So I'll tick through these kind of quickly. We took a hard look at temporary desalination, which would have involved deploying a prefabricated facility not intended for permanent use. So while the technology is feasible, it's also very expensive, in the range of $50 million with no long-term benefits. So the district decided this was not our best option at this time. Next, as you may be aware, Marin Water relies on imports, water imports from Sonoma County for 20 to 25% of our water supply. We've been working with our partner, the Sonoma County Water Agency, on a concept to capture what's being called winter water. In some ways, this is really a misnomer. Capturing water in the winter to store for later use is basic water management 101. Here, the idea specifically is to capture increases in flow in the Russian River beyond stream flow requirements. At this point, it's not clear how viable this option is for the near term, although it could be a great option for the long term. But in the near term, it's not clear we can get there for technical reasons, as well as the large number of competing demands for water on the Russian River, which of course serves a large number of communities. We're also exploring longer term options to capture water in groundwater basins in Sonoma County. Again, the idea is to store water in wet years for use in dry, but the capacity of the aquifer is unknown. It's still under study, as is any allocation that would be available to Marin. Nevertheless, as a long-term approach, underground storage is likely to be an important option for us going forward, as climate change makes reliance on large surface water reservoirs with high level of transevaporation less viable. Next slide. Our exploration of how to best access emergency. Oops, did I go mute there? Can you guys hear me?
You can now.
Okay, sorry about that. Did you hear my whole last thing? Hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, good. I don't know what happened there. Our exploration of how to best access emergency supply in severe drought situations has also led us to look again at voluntary water transfers. As Jay mentioned, California has an active water transfer market, but our ability to participate in that market will require that we connect to water infrastructure in the East Bay. There's been a fair amount of interest in the emergency intertie project, and you can see the basic pieces of it here on this slide with the pipeline alignment under the upper deck of the bridge. The idea basically is that a bridge pipeline would connect Marin to East Bay MUD's system, which is itself connected to a broader network of water utility infrastructure across the East Bay, South Bay, and Central Valley. So we would enter into a water lease with a willing seller and that wheel that water through the system as appropriate. So in addition to building the intertie, this approach involves a series of somewhat complex agreements with sister water agencies and sellers. So to tick through we are with this currently, we have a memorandum of agreement with East Bay MUD, enabling us to conduct engineering studies. We have another agreement with the Contra Costa Water District to allow for storage and possible exchange of transfer water. We'll need to issue bonds to pay for the project. And to meet the timetable, we're looking at a go, no-go decision within the next few months. As far as the transfer themselves, I know it sounds counterintuitive that given the severity of this drought, there would actually be water for sale, but our need is small relative to the amount of water available on the market. The district managers our district managers have been in discussions with potential sellers for some time, and the agency seems well positioned to obtain supplemental supply as needed, again, assuming the infrastructure is in place. So a few caveats about the Intertide project and potential transfers. First, unlike a permanent desal facility, so I'm making that distinction between the temporary facility I talked about a minute ago, the Intertide can be used on an as-needed basis. Permanent desal must be operated more or less continuously, which would entail very high ongoing operating costs, as well as massive energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and other impacts. But the Intertide could be accessed only when needed for drought relief. In addition, we can put guardrails around how and when and for what purposes water transfers are used. Right now, we're talking about limiting this use to support critical needs. And finally, we can also establish legal protections that ensure we are transferring wet water, by which I mean water that would have otherwise been dedicated to a specific consumptive use, such as irrigated agriculture, rather than further depleting rivers and streams. Next slide. Thank you. To close, I want to circle back and tick through just a few of the specific programs Marin Water is offering to reduce our community's overall water consumption, not merely in the near term, but to build that long-term drought resilience and sustainability. So we're very excited about these. So these include Cash for Grass. We're offering $3 a square foot, which may not sound like a lot, but it is a lot. The highest in the state, I believe, meeting the rebate being offered by the much larger Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. The maximum rebate would be about $5,000 for residential sites and $20,000 for commercial sites. Mulch Madness is a free sheet mulching program that is basically an alternative to the Cash for Grass approach. It includes delivery and installation of sheet mulching and the permanent disabling of lawn sprinklers. And as an added benefit, this is a service offered through a job training program for young adults. Flume meters. If I could have thought of another poll question, I'd ask how many of you have flume meters. The district is offering flume meters for just $50, which is 75% off the usual price. These give consumers real-time data using an app on your phone. And the early data is showing that people who are using these apps are dramatically changing their water use when they have the ability to see how they're using water in real time. Gray water systems. Gray water is that soapy water from your laundry or showers, not the icky water from other aspects of your in-home use. It's almost always perfectly safe to repurpose for outdoor irrigation. And we are offering a $100 rebate for laundry to landscape systems. Rain barrels and cisterns. Rain harvesting is the practice of collecting rainwater from rooftops and storing it for later non-potable use. It's more than you'd think. Just 1 inch of rain on a 1,000 square foot roof produces 600 gallons of runoff. The district is offering 50 cents per gallon of storage with a total on up to $1,000 per site. High efficiency toilets. Residential customers can receive up to $150 for replacing older toilets with new high efficiency models, $100 for high efficiency clothes washers, and $50 for hot water recirculating systems to reduce the water waste while you wait for the water to warm up. Say that 5 times fast, I dare you. So I know I was talking fast, but I know that the forum wants to leave time for questions. So I'll just say, if we go to the next slide, thank you for having me here today. And I look forward to the conversation.
But I will, first of all, I want to say thank you so much, Cynthia. I think people would love to hear more about the programs going on at MMWD. You know, we're all trying to do what we can. And I think we're all intrigued by the idea of making kind of structural changes. So it's not like the one-off, okay, I'm going to take short showers for a few months and then all bets are off. But so I would love to, could perhaps you start off by talking a little bit more about how people can find out more about the water saving initiatives through MMWD?
Sure. Honestly, the best thing is to head to that website, marinwater.org. We have a whole page on the rebates, and I think the rebates are probably the best way to to really become involved. And as I was saying, we really see that as a way for the district, for our ratepayers, to be making those long-term investments. I know it's a little bit outside of the box, but we tend to think of infrastructure as pipes, tanks, reservoirs, But I'll just say I see infrastructure as all of those options. Every low water landscape, every rain cistern, every flume meter, that is all water infrastructure. It's all contributing to long-term drought resilience. So head to that webpage. You can email me through that address that I had on that last slide. Or reach out directly. Oh, one thing I didn't put on the slide because I just forgot is the district is offering also free audits. I think staff is a little overwhelmed right now, but we will send out folks from our fantastic conservation staff to basically walk through your home or business and help you identify, where there are opportunities for long-term savings. What you may have a leak, you may have, you may not be using water efficiently outside, whatever it is. They're a great crew.
That sounds terrific. And does that webpage, just to clarify, before I ask him to lead the questions, just to clarify, does it explain how to get a flume meter? Because that sounds intriguing to me.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great, because when you look at the average household, we're all like, but I don't take as many showers as those people. I think it would be great to get really specific information on individual appliances and use. So thank you.
Yeah. So I'll just say one quick thing since you mentioned flume. We actually had somebody, lots of people show up at our meetings and often they're not very happy, but we did have somebody come just to say that her water use in her household had been radically changed, to thank us for offering the flume. I guess she has a lot of people in her home and she said they decreased their water use within just a month or so by 17%, which I thought was really amazing. And so we've heard those stories a lot, that this is a particularly effective piece of technology.
Well, fantastic. You can't manage what you don't measure, right? So exactly.
Cynthia, you were just talking about some of the benefits. I've got here a question. Will you continue with the cash for grass, the lawn replacements, and tell us more about mulch madness?
So I have to say, I'm not a mulch person, but the idea of mulch madness is that for people who don't want to give up their lawns, it's a way of preserving local landscape, residential, well, I guess all landscape, by covering, grassy areas with mulch. To keep it healthy, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but it's basically an alternative to taking out your grass and putting in low water landscaping. But it comes with this requirement that you turn off your sprinklers. So it's a way of preserving and making more healthy the soil, for future plantings, while limiting water use. And then on cash for grass, I would, I don't want to get too out ahead of the rest of my board, but in my work in my day job, we've certainly seen that changing out landscapes in the arid West. A lot of us in the West, came from the East where it rains, tens of inches of rain every year, and we think we can have, roses and azaleas and all the rest of it. And the idea is to really change that culture and get people more comfortable with native landscaping, which I have to say, it doesn't mean we all have to have cactuses or hardscape. We really want landscaping for, climate change reasons. That's a whole other conversation. But what we really should be doing is changing our culture so that we are comfortable with beautiful native low water landscaping. And because we use an enormous amount of water, it's really the single largest, and Jay can ground truth me on this, one of the single largest uses of water in California and the West are lawns, which, I have kids, it was fun to have a lawn, but it's not necessary. And there's alternatives that can be just as beautiful and just as productive. And that's really where we're going to save enormous amounts of water. So Jay, do you want to jump in there? Because I know this is something you looked at a lot.
Yeah, if you want to save water in the urban landscape, dry up your lawns. It's by far the most effective. It provides water when you need it the most, where you need it the most, and it's the cheapest way to expand your water supplies is to use less water on your lawns.
We had another question about from Terry Thomas. She was saying that areas that aren't supplied by MMWD and work from wells are having salt water intrusion and are also drawn from salmon streams that start to affect the coho population. Any thoughts on ways to help these folks?
That is a really good question. And the person asking it is correct, that we don't serve those communities which are basically on wells. I will say that there are management is having conversations with those communities about how we can be supportive. And again, I believe it's fair to say that my board is very interested in how we can be good neighbors, but we don't today have a solution for that, given just the challenges of the infrastructure, because these are systems that are not on our grid. So I think that's going to be an ongoing conversation with those communities and with the county. And there is actually a sort of an informal group that's discussing it.
And Christine, I believe you had a question going forward.
There was something you mentioned that I really wanted to follow up on because I've heard mention of it from time to time and I want to understand it better. You talked about flow requirements. Can you talk more about what flow requirements are and why they're important?
I can, but I should probably defer to Professor Lund on that. Flow requirements are established by the state and regional boards to protect our streams and rivers and make sure that we have enough, notwithstanding, dams and, other diversions that take water out of those streams, that we're keeping enough water in those streams at the right time, at the right temperature to protect habitat, to protect fish and wildlife. So Jay, I want to defer to you on that.
That's about right. There's also a California Department of Fish and Wildlife law that requires that below all dams there be enough water flowing to support fish populations. Cynthia probably knows that. Is it 5937?
5937. I've actually written law review articles about that. So that's a whole long conversation. So it is a law, but it's not one with a lot of teeth to it. So.
But that's true. Although there's certainly a lot of people trying to grow teeth into that law.
Yeah.
And maybe with a little bit of success. But actually, I've been very surprised in the last drought or so looking into the details that very few streams in California actually have these environmental flow requirements. And that's probably, that's a big problem actually, I think, for a lot of these streams.
It's a big part of the reason that our salmon are becoming extirpated.
That's right.
To Obi's point.
It's not just the big rivers, it's also the small ones. It's often the tributaries, which is where their spawning grounds were and their rearing grounds.
Yep. I will say, as far as Marin, I'm very proud of our stewardship. We do have endangered species, and our water operations are subject to flow requirements, which we are scrupulous about meeting.
Thank you. And you'd mentioned the coho salmon again. And Obi, I'm wondering if you could just explain again, just really briefly, like, what is a keystone species? You mentioned it several times, but why are the salmon so incredibly important?
Well, they are incredibly important for a great many reasons across the entirety of the California floristic province, which is everything west of the crest of the Sierra Nevada. Historically, when you think of runs of millions of people-sized salmon returning every spring and fall to their headwaters, much of which is closed off because of the impoundments that y'all were talking about earlier. We have over 1,400 named dams in California. Most of them are deadbeat dams that are past their usable life and utility. You think about these millions of salmon going up to then as part of this larger biodiversity network, including beaver. You remember that there was, of course, the fur rush 30 years before there was the gold rush. The fur rush, we saw beaver in a population density of about 15 million inside the CFP, the California Floristic Province. That was one beaver for every 0.5 kilometers of water course. That means there was 2 or 3 beavers per mile of river up and down California, and that tremendously affected the hydrological cycle. In fact, we're only a couple of generations away from people who remember pre-gold rush, our indigenous sovereignties here who remember pre-gold rush populations of beaver and salmon, where you have these extremely fecund, wet watersheds that are now arid and degraded, infirmed and disconnected. The salmon then would journey up these beaver terraces, almost like ascending a staircase to their spawning grounds, and then of course deposit their mortal bodies on the ground. So we're talking about, and then be distributed in flood across the Central Valley and beyond. And that of course is or a contributing factor to the incredible blessing and curse that is California agriculture across the Sacramento and San Joaquin River valleys. This Holocene alluvium that is so rich with nutrients, the best soil in the world. In fact, of course, the curse of the Mediterranean climate is that you need about 20 inches of rain to grow anything without irrigation, and we get an average of 13 to even as far as 7 to 4 inches down in the Westlands watershed, where most of the almonds are being grown right now too. So it's an incredibly complex system that is now being starved. Not only of course the topsoil is being starved, but the forests themselves now overcrowded. We have a very complex problem to work on, but I would love to maybe even have a second chapter to this, where one of Jay's great graphics was the problems that we are facing, and I thought that really described the challenges we face. And I would come back and would love to robustly discuss that. For every one of those challenges, opportunities are here on the table, solutions are all here, we know what to do, which is of course the source of my guarded hopefulness. So I might have obliquely answered your question. In this time of unraveling, it is clear that humanity is the keystone species. The decisions that we make inside of our human ecology affect all of biodiversity, but we cannot go on without that biodiversity. And in fact, the extant ecosystems that the salmon represents and supports are paramount to our own healthy communities.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Hey, thank you.
I'm looking at a question from Alan Jones. How does the Central Valley groundwater situation play a role in California water practices? Jay, do you want to take that one on?
So, California is a very big and very diverse place with a very diverse and highly variable hydrology. We tend to find there's some place in California that you could probably make almost anything work in dire enough circumstances. Cynthia had a case of extracting fog water, which is kind of a charming idea, but the public health problems on that are probably the biggest ones in my mind. So I think this is just from an academic's perspective, it's just a wondrous system to have the privilege of working on, and it's important to so many people in so many different ways. But we're going to have debates and arguments about this for a long time, and we're stuck with it. The nice thing about our debates and arguments is that it does actually help us run the system better over time. We do make improvements, and we can still always do a better job.
Great. There's an interesting question here too from Jim. He's talking specifically about Marin, but I think Marin's unique this way. I think this is much different when you're talking about a larger, for example, California, and that is, how do consumers rank in water use when you compare residential versus agriculture versus commercial or industrial? So Jay, can you talk about that on a larger scale? And then Cynthia, how about in Marin? How does that work in Marin?
So in terms of total human use, agriculture is about 80% of all human water use in California.
Right.
Of the remaining 20%, which is urban, probably 60 or 70% of that, I'd say on average, is residential. And half of that is lawns.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
But I think that there's a bunch of different ways to parse the numbers, of course. I wrote
yes.
I wrote that little book and as almost like a reaction. My State of Water book is a reaction, or is like a meditation on those billboards you see going down I-5. It's like where the billboards claim that it's like more like 40%. And what they're talking, of course, about is total rainfall over the state, right? So 80% is captured within the water infrastructure.
I think developed supply is the best.
The developed supply. That's the human water use is what I call it.
Right.
That's right.
And it's not the precipitation. Actually, more than half of the precipitation actually evaporates back up to the atmosphere.
That's right. Yep.
So it's of the total runoff from my statistics I was using. But of the urban use, about 70% is for residential.
Thank you. That's right.
6% or so is industrial, which varies tremendously across towns and cities across the state. And then the rest will be mostly commercial and public parks and things like that.
So just quickly I think I'm answering this question as far as Marin goes. We are a bedroom community. So we have 62,000 accounts, and I believe 92% of those are residential. And by residential, I mean both single family and multifamily. And within that, we've got tiers. 60% of our residential consumers, or maybe 66%, are in tier 1, meaning they're using a fairly moderate amount of water. We have a very small number, maybe 8%, I could be getting that wrong, are in tier 4, where they're using, let's just say, a boatload of water. And then tiers 2 and 3 are there as well. We don't, just to be clear, because this is really confuses folks, we're an urban water provider, as is North Marin. We don't provide any water at all to agriculture. Occasionally, like I say, there are friends and our neighbors. And so, for example, during this last drought, a number of agricultural water users came to us and said, we are in big trouble. And so we have, we'll provide them with water when we can. So for example, they'll truck water from Sulawesi or something, but we don't have infrastructure that provides water to agriculture, which gets all of its water in Marin from groundwater. And then as for commercial and industrial, it's small in Marin. We certainly have a lot of businesses and institutions, but like I say, it's roughly 8% of our total number of accounts.
Okay.
We do work with them really closely. So I want to give our local businesses and institutions high marks for their conservation. Even, I know this will get me in trouble, even the golf courses, which are definitely our highest water users, or among our highest water users, I should say. But they're working with us very constructively in conserving and using recycled water.
Okay, great. And then that goes into, we have a question about desalinization that has come up. Bruce Webster writes, there's land available in West Marin for solar desalinization, in particular at Dillon Beach. Desalinization creates higher concentrated brine discharge. How can pilots be supported by Coastal Commission and the County of Marin to allow this discharge to be returned to saline water sources?
So that's a lot, and those are a fairly significant number of technical questions. What I would say is the staff has looked into solar powered desal and has reached the conclusion that it is not technically feasible. Dillon Beach is, of course, outside of our service area. But what I would say to Bruce, and I'm happy to address this in more detail, and I'll just say this generally, it looks to me like we're not going to get through all of the questions. So Kim and your crew, if you guys can capture those, I mean, any of them for Marin Water, I can work with my team to get those answers. Some of them are fairly technical, and the management and staff are going to be able to give us the kind of detailed responses that I think your participants here deserve. So I'm just going to say to folks, if we don't get to your questions, as long as Marin Forum, the Environmental Forum, can get those to me, I'll do my best to turn those around and provide you with those answers. And I don't know, maybe you can put them on the website or whatever. But I don't want people to feel that they're not getting their questions answered.
That would be great, because we do have many now that need to be
Yeah, I'm seeing
answered.
that, right?
And what we do after this event is everyone who's registered gets a copy of the recording, and then I can include with that the answer to some of these questions or follow up. So the answers will be coming via email.
Okay.
Great. Did you want to talk a little bit more about desalination, or shall we move on? I think we can do one more question, then I'm going to have Anne Christine wrap us up, because we are going on, it's 5:27. So let's see, other places around the world and around California use a water purification technology to clean recycled water to produce safe, high quality drinking water. Can you tell us to what extent Marin Water has explored the complete water use option as a longer term solution?
Yes, I would say we have explored this constantly. And we do actually partner with Las Colinas, so we do use recycled water where we can. The challenge in Marin is that we are an older community. We're actually the oldest municipal water district in the state. So the problem with reusing water, which by the way, we all totally support, is that we'd have to replumb an enormous amount of our existing system. And as you know, Marin, has got very challenging topography. So, moving purple pipe everywhere is not feasible financially. So where we are we're, like I say, working with Las Colinas to recycle where we can. I think it's only about 2 or 3% of our supply, but we are exploring those options. But it's challenging in a built out community. Your best opportunities for reusing wastewater like that is in new development, when you can be building in the purple pipe from the ground, from ground up. That's why we've been focusing so much on on-site reuse options like gray water, like cisterns, all these things that can be done relatively affordably in a on site, rather than putting the investment in a whole massive purple pipe system.
Great, thank you so much. Jay, did you have anything to add to that? If
you're muted, Jay.
Oh, yeah. The thought occurred to me that if you have a pipeline that runs to between Richmond and Marin, if you had a wastewater treatment plant that could, in the right location, that you could connect economically to that purple pipe, to that pipeline, you could send it perhaps, you could look into sending it to the refineries in Richmond. And
that is a really interesting thought.
That might be economical, particularly after you built the pipe. And
that's a really interesting
thought. Get them to pay for the treatment.
Yeah, we'll connect with you offline about that.
That's just a notion that came to mind.
Right. That's assuming we build the pipe. I want to emphasize that this is not.
I actually think it might be wise to build the pipe just as a contingency.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much, Anne Christine. I'm going to let you take over and wrap this up.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone here today. Thank you so much for coming, everyone, and especially to our panelists, Obi, Jay, and Cynthia. That was a really thoughtful and wide-ranging presentation and discussion, and we really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. I'd also like to thank again our sponsor, Drawdown Marin, for its support of this program. As we've mentioned a couple of times, we'll be following up with an email that has recommended actions and resources from our speakers and from our sponsor. There will also be a link to a recording of this event so that you can review or share what you've learned this evening. We are also going to take advantage of Cynthia's offer to look at any questions that we didn't get a chance to ask. That's very generous of you. Thank you, Cynthia.